Hello and welcome to the Healthy Minds Speaker Series. It's great that we can connect again. I'm really looking forward to today's topic. We're going to talk today about pandemic fatigue. And I don't know if you're like me, but I've certainly been feeling a lot of that myself. And as I've been talking to others, I think this is a really timely topic and one that we'll all be able to relate to. And so before I introduce our speaker, just a reminder in terms of our approach. We're going to be hearing from our guests for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to be opening it up to Q&A. If you have any questions at all, just click on the person with the raised hand in the top right corner. Click on there, and we'll answer as many questions as we're able. I'm Peter Neufeld, and I'm part of the HR team here at Maple Leaf. So with that, I'd like to welcome back Dr. Dana Lee Bagley. Dr. Bagley, it's so good to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think this is our third time, and you're always incredibly insightful, and so we really appreciate you spending time with us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So I will get started then if you'd like to click through the slides. Next slide. So yep, just a bit of background on me. So I am a registered psychologist. I work at the hospital in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So technically we're all frontline providers, but we have been very fortunate with our case numbers in Nova Scotia. I also do research at Dalhousie University and St. Mary's University. And I'm coming to you today from Howard HR, where I'm a senior consultant as well as the director of research. Next, and that's my social media if you want to hear about Pandemic Brain on your Twitter feed. Next slide. So I don't know about any of you, but I think I actually was hoping and expecting 2021 to be better than 2020, and thus far it has not been. And so I think I unwittingly hoped it would magically be better, and yet it's not. And this is actually what we know. So if you can click one click here, is that we're actually still in the crisis part of this pandemic, and there will be long-term things that we're going to need to deal with. And many of those things are just things we should plan to have to deal with. They're not things that we will be able to avoid or do something now to overcome. We just want to be keeping in mind these things as we move forward. Next slide. So I think it's helpful to understand how our brains react to stress, right? So our caveman brain, built in cave people time, is responsible for things like emotions, automatic thoughts, memories, learning, appetite regulation, and it's built for survival. It's an awesome system if you're a cave person and your life expectancy is 30, right? You're always about living for today. And doing what's going to work for survival. It also functions unconsciously and automatically. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll pull your hand away before you consciously register pain. That is our caveman brain in action, trying to keep you safe. Next slide. The other relevant part of our brain is our prefrontal cortex, or our frontal lobe. And this is a part of our brain that does executive functioning. And that means things like starting behavior, stopping behavior, planning. It basically controls behavior. This is where willpower comes from. This is where self-control comes from. And unlike our caveman brain, it functions like a battery. And so we will wear out that battery of self-control as we use up that frontal lobe throughout our day. Next slide. And so it's important to keep in mind that in COVID-19, our caveman brains are on fire and our frontal lobe batteries are spent. So again, we have this ongoing threat. Caveman brains don't care about probabilities. They don't care about how many cases are in your environment. They just work on the worst case scenario. And clearly for many of us across the country, there are like really a serious threat in terms of the numbers around us, which hopefully are going down in most places right now. But as we get out of wave 2, right, we've all been under this ongoing threat. And our frontal lobe batteries are incredibly spent because it takes way more effort to get through a COVID day than a non-COVID day. So, you know, I like to say everything takes longer in a pandemic, whether that's writing a report or going grocery shopping, it just takes longer to do. We have to use up that frontal lobe to do all of these behaviors for COVID-19 that we're supposed to be doing. And so that's using up that battery a lot. And the behaviors keep changing, right? There's new rules. Am I in a red zone? What am I allowed to do? All of that is using up our batteries. Next slide. And so we know from research that stress impairs things like concentration, memory, attention, problem solving, and decision making. And this isn't because you're not trying hard enough. This is just how brains work under stress, right? So pandemic brain is a real thing. If you're not sure what day of the week it is, I refer to pandemic brain frequently in my emails when I've forgotten to reply to something, when I'm late with something. I refer often to pandemic brain or pandemic life because we actually know this is what happens to brains under stress. Next slide. And so the other issue about stress over time is that we can have some resistance to stress, but over a period of time, if that chronic stress continues, we end up in a period of exhaustion. And so this is, I think, what a lot of people are experiencing around this pandemic fatigue, is we've had the alarm system, we've done the resistance where we're trying to cope, and many of us are getting into the exhaustion phase because, again, this has gone on for so long. Next slide. And so burnout is actually, a relevant way of understanding how we're feeling right now, which is it's a long-term consequence of chronic stress that's unresolved. And it's a workplace, definition, but I think even if you're not in a workplace, we're feeling this, which is that sense of exhaustion, right? Just depletion, distance, kind of feeling disconnected, cynicism, which is a sort of like, why bother? Is it really worth it? Why am I doing this? And reduce professional efficacy. So really feeling like you're not on your top game, you're not, performing well. And this is a well-known effect that we know happens to people under chronic stress. And I think it can help us understand why we're feeling the way we're feeling now. Next slide. And so the antidote, this is a quote, the antidote to exhaustion isn't rest, it's wholeheartedness. And so next slide again. And so the antidote to burnout isn't rest. It's actually reactivating meaning and purpose. Now, clearly for some groups of people, like, hospital workers, they are actually physically exhausted as well. They're not sleeping, they're not eating well, and so they actually need physical rest. But for some people, it's not the physical rest that is needed. It's reactivating a sense of meaning and purpose, trying to target this burnout, finding ways to recharge your batteries, but also to find meaning and purpose again. Next slide. And so we can make use of what we know is a concept from one of the interventions that we do in psychology that's been shown to help in research, which is about understanding our values. And values are about how you want to show up. They're about like who or what really matters, the kind of person that you want to be, how we want to show up. And so how do we want to, what do you want to stand for during this crisis? What kind of personal qualities do you want to exhibit? And this is important because we can express our values at any moment of the day. Our culture is very, concerned with goals, and that's understandable. But goals are things that happen or don't happen, and they're controlled by a lot of different things, not just our effort. Whereas values are about how we want to show up, and they get expressed through our behavior. And so they are readily available to us at any moment of the day to be expressing our values through our behavior. Next slide. And so there's actually studies showing that if we can be more psychologically flexible, that people are coping better through the pandemic. And what this means is that we can have the same values, but it might look different than it did before. So for example, I have a value around connecting with my parents, but they live in another province. In non-pandemic times, that value was expressed through going to visit them or having them visit us. And so typically we would have seen them 5 or 6 times in the last year. And of course, we haven't seen them at all. And so, to express that value of connecting with my parents, it's going to look different in a pandemic. So now it involves more text messages. We sometimes will have a family dinner and we'll put the laptop on the table with grandma and grandpa on the laptop, and we just have a normal dinner. So I think we're doing great in the pandemic in terms of using technology for these formal meetings and business meetings, but I think we need to make more use of it in terms of informal connections, right? So I'm on a group chat with my colleagues at work and we just talk about ordinary things, right? It's the kind of connection that we're missing when we go to the workplace, we're at the coffee station or pass by somebody's desk and say hello. And so these kinds of informal connections. And when we can accept that we can express our values, but it's going to look different, then we can recapture a whole bunch of things that might be important to us that we may feel like we've lost in the pandemic. So for example, staycations, right? So based on our public health guidelines, you know, I've had lots of clients go for holidays in the city, like where they live. They just go to a different part of the city and go to the hotel there and pretend to be a tourist. And again, that's possible based on our kind of public health guidelines right now. But looking for ways to express the things that are important to you, if we can accept that it'll look different, then we can actually recapture things that are important to us. And this is the definition of psychological flexibility, is that we can do things that look different and be flexible about how we express our values. Next slide. And so, you know, there's a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning, and he was a psychiatrist who lived through the Holocaust. And so he wrote about his experience of being in a concentration camp and how to make meaning, even in circumstances like that. And so I actually read his book during the pandemic because I thought, well, if he can make meaning during in a concentration camp in the Holocaust, then we can find a way to make meaning now. And one of the things that he talked about is that when people gave up hope, that was when people would die. There were lots of reasons why their physical bodies would give out, but when they lost hope for the future, then they all knew that person was going to, you know, succumb to the physical conditions soon. And people would say, you know, when they lost hope, they'd say things like, well, there's nothing left for me in life. There's, you know, my family's gone. There's nothing left for me. I won't have a job. And he said that the role was to help people figure out and to reframe that, is that it didn't matter, you know, what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. That there may still be things that you need to contribute or to be here or to, you know, express your values moving forward. And so this living through a pandemic will impact us. It will, you know, change us. But if we think about what has the pandemic taught us about what values really matter to us and what's most important, then we can have that be its impact on us. And I work with people living through cancer. And so when you are faced with a life-threatening illness like that, they always reevaluate what's really important. And overwhelmingly, what comes to the top is that they want to spend more time loving the people who are important to them. And of course, in the pandemic, that's going to look different, right? But we can make use of this to understand what really matters to move forward through the rest of this pandemic, and when the pandemic hopefully ends, about how we want it to have impacted us. And so we want to plan for the future, but the difference is we want to think about values and not goals. Life is very uncertain. We don't know what will be available to us in terms of achieving goals, but we can always express our values. That's always available to us because that's about how we want to show up as a person. Next slide. And so, you know, things to do in terms of thinking, you know, reactivating, dealing with this pandemic fatigue, reconnect with your values, think about what's important to you, what the pandemic has taught you is important to you, activate your 5 senses to deal with the monotony, right? Get a new essential oil, get a new body wash, and try to, you know, connect with your senses, because we can, again, find kind of energizing by being present in the moment and noticing differences that are happening. Reconnect socially, find ways to reconnect with people, making use of technology in informal ways, and savor the moment. If you're having a laugh, if you're having a cuddle, right, give some extra hugs to the people in your bubble, because we're all hug deprived, and savor the moments that feel good. And then rinse and repeat. These are not things you do once, right? You don't decide your values once and then you're done. These are things that we want to keep doing again and again. It does require your frontal lobe to activate, you know, your values and to choose your behavior, but this can really reignite our sense of meaning and purpose and what we're doing here and help guide us as we move forward. Next slide. So that's the end of the formal presentation, and we can turn it over to questions and answers.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Lee Bagley. And And again, reminder, folks, if you have questions, please click on the link and we'll get to as many as we can. Dr. Lee Bagley, when we're looking at the, often people talk, though, about the new normal. And we're coming up on 12 months. So soon it will be 12 months since we actually went into different forms of lockdown and experienced, our new setup. With what you're describing, will there be a point where this will actually, the caveman brain will not be activated in the same way, and our limbic system won't be impacted in the same way, and we'll be able to settle into this?
So there will be a point at which, the alarm system won't be as loud, but caveman brains always remember threat, right? And that's, again, a good survival technique, is to always remember things that were threatening. And so overall, we would actually anticipate that we're all going to be slightly more anxious, slightly a bit more on edge, because we've lived through this threatening thing. And so caveman brains don't forget that. Again, we can override our caveman brain in lots of ways with our frontal lobe through our behavior. And so there's a difference between what you're feeling and what you do. And some people describe this as like fake it till you make it, but I actually think that when you're behaving the way you want to, even when your caveman brain is telling you to do something else, that's actually being your most authentic self, not faking it. That is making a choice to show up the way you want to in a meaningful way, even when nothing else in your body or mind wants to show up that way. And so we will anticipate a long-term consequence of this, and from a mental health perspective, that will take quite a while to address. And so again, it's that we need to be a lot more mindful and deliberate about charging our frontal lobe and taking care of ourselves, because even when the pandemic ends, there will be these lasting consequences that we'll need to keep dealing with.
Can you say a little bit more about those long-term consequences? I've heard it a lot in the news and in different media, and people are often saying that, like you say, once things improve, don't expect that things will have completely improved. Can you elaborate a little bit in terms of what some of those consequences would be?
Yep. So we know that when people are in crisis mode, and we're still sort of in crisis mode, that people will stay focused, kind of do what they need to do. And then when the crisis itself passes, then a whole bunch of other things can surface. And one of the quotes I like best about the pandemic is "same storm, different boat," which is that people experience the pandemic dramatically different. It is different if you have children at home and you're trying to work from home. It's different if you're a frontline worker or an essential worker that has to keep going to work. It's different if you live by yourself and you're, in lockdown all alone. And so there will be various responses, right? Some people will be ecstatic to go back to the office, and other people will be very anxious about it. And so for organizations, we really want people to be as flexible as possible to help people adjust. Having a sense of control really helps people's mental well-being. And when they have some control, within certain boundaries around returning to work, or when they do that or how they do that, it really helps people cope. But we'll have some long-term consequences. I remember the first time I started socializing again in person, and I was like, I don't know how to do this anymore. I can't remember how to make small chat in person. So we'll have all kinds of things around social anxiety. People will still have problems sleeping. There will still be lingering effects of depression and burnout. And so there will be, another major issue will be grief. There'll be a whole bunch of people who have lost someone during the pandemic, and oftentimes didn't get to have a funeral the way we normally do to help cope with that loss. Maybe didn't get to say goodbye to them because of COVID restrictions. And so, in frontline workers, we'll see things like PTSD and moral injury that we tend to see in soldiers returning from wars. So there will be long-term, mental health consequences to this. They're all things we know how to treat. They're things that we are able to do something about, but we're going to have to be deliberate about it.
So there's a question here. It says, some people seem to be thriving during COVID, and I'm not. Any thoughts? And I guess it's around the question, are some immune? Are some almost immune from the impact?
Yeah, so same storm, different boats. Like, again, one of my colleagues wrote a book during lockdown. I was just trying to not kill my child during lockdown. Like, that was a pure survival situation for me. His situation is entirely different than mine. Some, things that are habitual for us will be easier to do. So, my sister has asked, how are doctors and nurses still functioning? And it's because the things they're doing are part of their habits. They have done those medical things thousands of times, so they're actually part of their habits, and so they're able to keep doing them. So for some people who have habits that were about productivity, they may be able to rely on more of their caveman brain to get those things done, right? And so that's sometimes people cope, right? People cope in different ways. Sometimes people cope by being busy, right? They cope by distracting themselves, and that's a way that they've learned to cope. So certainly the majority of people are not thriving, right? That would not be the norm. The norm is certainly like surviving, right? And I like to say staying steady is a win in a pandemic. So adjusting our expectations for what's realistic is really important. If this was World War III, then we would have gotten rid of all kinds of expectations and just focused on the war effort. And that actually would help us manage our stress levels, because there would be all kinds of things we just would forget about that just don't happen during wartime. And so, but what we've done in the pandemic is we've just added the stress of the pandemic onto the stress of everyday life. And everyday life was already kind of stressful. So it's really important to be kind to ourselves about what's realistic. I often will ask myself, would I expect myself to be able to do this in World War III? And if the answer is no, then it's okay to let it go, right? Again, same storm, different boats. So we don't know the circumstances for other people, but it is normal that we are not at our best. We're not at our most productive. Staying steady is a win in a pandemic.
It's funny when you mentioned about one of the things was have different smells or different experiences. I would have never thought of myself as a diffuser guy. I don't think I even knew what one is. And yet now I seem to be the one in our family who's going through the little oils and putting it in the machine to have a different experience.
Yeah, we actually got like an advent calendar that was different, like scents, for essential oils. And so it was awesome. We got all these little trial ones to give a go, and it was really nice.
Oh, that's awesome. So folks, as a reminder too, on the screen, you can see the slide that has some of the resources that we have available. And one of the things that we think is really important is that you, as you feel the need or want to explore, that you go to the site and you see what's available. And then you can also be able to check and say, okay, would it make sense to talk to someone? We're really wanting to lower the bar in terms of expectations, in terms of saying, should I get therapy or not? And we're really framing it a lot as learning new skills. And I think Dr. Lee Bagley is really, talking in a similar way in terms of being gentle with ourselves and trying new things. And maybe this is one of the things you want to try.
And again, none of us would ever expect ourselves to have the coping skills to get through a pandemic, right? We keep calling it unprecedented times. So maybe one of the unprecedented things we need to do is to get professional mental health support. And my psychologist would definitely agree with me.
There's a question here about toxic positivity, and I've been hearing more about it myself also. It says toxic positivity is a term I've been seeing lately. Can you define that term? And I guess it kind of fits with this idea in terms of how some are viewing our current experience.
Yeah, so toxic positivity is about when people are forced sort of to look at the bright side or look at the silver lining, right? Forced to kind of just think positively. And the issue, the toxic part of it is that if you're not feeling positive, then being forced to think positively actually invalidates our feelings, right? And many of us, I would say the majority of us, are not thinking positively. There's a lot of stress and a lot of turmoil going on. And so forcing people to look on the bright side, or this too shall pass, don't worry about it, is actually invalidating their experiences. And so, there's a form of therapy called compassion-focused therapy. And compassion is defined as recognizing suffering and a desire to alleviate it. And that to me is a different thing than thinking positively, because you still get to points where you're saying like, we're going to get through this, we're in it together, but first we're acknowledging the suffering. And it actually requires courage to get in touch with somebody else's pain, to share your pain, right? That actually takes a lot of courage to do. But without that recognition of the suffering we're all going through, skipping over to the thinking positively, it's very invalidating and just makes us feel disconnected from people. Because if we're not feeling positive, and again, the majority of us are not, then we think, oh, I guess there's something wrong with me. They all feel good and I don't, so there must be something wrong with me. When in fact, they're also experiencing, distress and despair. They're just not sharing it. And that's why it's so important to talk and to share. And again, validating other people's experiences. Sometimes just listening and acknowledging is what makes people feel better. We don't have to fix it. We don't have to think differently about it, right? Just sharing it sometimes is helpful for humans.
So I think you've touched on this a little bit already, but there's a question. It says, how do you see our mental recovery after this pandemic compared to human recovery for previous or other pandemics? And I think you were touching on the idea that we have more supports, but is there anything else that you would like to say for this question?
Yeah, well, certainly I think this is the first pandemic in most of our lifetimes, right? So previous pandemics did occur, and in fact, the baby boomer generation is probably the only generation in history that didn't have to live through a world war or a pandemic. And so we feel like we're like the exclusion, but actually the baby boomers are the ones that are different. Every other generation in history has had to deal with this. Compared to the last pandemic of the Spanish flu in 1918, we have enormous resources available to us that weren't available then, right? So technology, science and medicine, there was no vaccine for the Spanish flu, right? We've had one developed, admittedly not being distributed as fast as everybody wants, but available, in a year, which is definitely, that a miracle. And I believe it's still safe as well, even though they made it quickly. And so, because I think a lot of money went into that, and so they know what they're doing. We make vaccines all the time. We make a flu vaccine every year. So I still think it's safe, even though it was quick. So we have these resources that are available to us, and so that gives us the hope that we can actually get through this, more effectively and maybe with fewer losses. But there's always going to be an effect to this. If you've lost somebody in the pandemic, there's no technology to fix grief. We just know that grief exists, and we know that we can help people through grief. Right? So it's not that these things disappear, it's that we know how to identify them, we know how to support people through them.
So there's a question here. I went to consult a doctor earlier this week with ear pain. This question isn't about her ear. The doctor told me that I didn't have infection, but my jaw was inflamed by being too tight. She said stress was the cause and mentioned COVID stress. Is that a real thing, feeling pain due to the stress?
Yeah, absolutely it is. So it's a very well-established phenomenon that pain gets worse under stress. So if you have existing pain, it's going to get worse, and you can develop new pain. So when our bodies are tense, right, again, our caveman brain does a cascade of neurochemicals, biological changes as a result of a threat that we have zero control over. It changes hormones, it changes neurotransmitters. You have no choice about that. And one of the things it does is it gets muscles ready for action. And this is a fantastic thing to do if the threat is a bear, right? And you need to run away from the bear or you need to fight the bear. Not quite as useful in a pandemic going on 12 months, because it actually makes our bodies tense, right? Whether that's your jaw or your shoulders or your limbs. And so that tension over time can result in sort of pain. Being persistent. And so we actually absolutely know that stress can be expressed through our bodies as well as through other kinds of symptoms of distress. And this is why it's really important to be doing what we can to take care of ourselves and to be more deliberate about that, because we actually do have more stress, right? We do have more stress in our environment.
And we're down to our last minute, but there's a question here, and it's really about how some people are starting to kind of deny the concerns about COVID now, but it's that they weren't people who were denying it before. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so again, people cope in different ways. And sometimes when your frontal lobe is really tired, when it's been worn out by the pandemic of getting through it this long, they just don't have enough frontal lobe to kind of think logically. And so sometimes people cope by saying, nope, it's fine, I'm good, right? And a lot of things, there's a difference between whether things work well in the short term or the long term. Many things work well in the short term, it's just they have costs in the long term. And so I think, again, this is about being kind to ourselves, being kind to other people, connect with people who, you know, share your beliefs and share your experiences so that you do have someone that validates you and that you don't feel like it's just me or I'm going crazy, because that kind of connection can help normalize it for us. And we just allow people to be where they're at, same storm, different boats, but make sure you connect with people who share your experiences so you don't feel as alone.
So, folks, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank you for joining. A big thank you to Dr. Lee Bagley. It's always great to have you with us, and appreciate your insights on the fatigue that so many of us are experiencing. And I'd also like to remind you, we're going to be having a session next week that is going to be about exploring happiness. And so I think it's very aligned to what we talked about today in terms of being able to connect with our values and the things that bring us happiness and joy. So I wish you a good rest of the day and look forward to connecting soon. Thank you.
Thank you.